Hi there. This is Mel Levitt, welcoming you to Wild Cargo, the program that each week brings man-sized adventure right into your living rooms. Where do we go this week? Asia? Africa? The jungles of the Amazon? You'll find out in just a minute as we embark on this week's adventure on Wild Cargo. All right, tell us, what's our Wild Cargo this week?
Well, this week, Mel, we go back into Mexico, leaving Siam from last week's trip.
Well, what kind of an animal were you after?
Well, we were hunting, among other things, and in fact, primarily hunting jaguar. We were a little unsuccessful in this particular quest, and we ended up hunting javelina, which are the peccary or wild boars. You perhaps have known them under various names. You'll see them a little later in the film here, so there's no point in going into too much a description about the appearance at the moment.
Well, this sounds pretty hair-raising. Let's get to that film right now.
You probably know, Mel, of the 20 years or so that I've spent collecting animals, more than half this time has been spent within the country of Mexico. Now, in addition to offering the advantage of being readily accessible from this country, Mexico offers a number of other tremendous advantages for a would-be animal collector. The prime one being that they have, within Mexico, practically all types of wildlife that are found anywhere in the American tropics. Now, ranging from the deserts of the north to the mountains of the central portions and the jungle sections of the western coast and southeastern Mexico, you can find practically any type of terrain and practically any type of wildlife that you wish. Of course, as you know also, Mel, most of our collecting in Mexico has been for reptiles. But in addition, upon occasion, we have been called upon by friends and acquaintances of mine in Mexico to undertake another type of hunting. That is called control hunting. By the way, here's one of the more interesting little reptiles that we encounter occasionally in Mexico, and sometimes in great numbers in certain regions. This fellow is the basilisk. He's locally called the Jesus Christ lizard, and the reason for this name is the fact that this lizard is capable of running on the water. You'll notice his feet are not webbed, and the native Indians, seeing this animal perform this feat and noticing that his feet are not webbed, of course considered this a miracle, and thereby gave him the name the Jesus Christ lizard. Now, of course, he performs this feat through no use of miraculous powers, but rather by sheer speed. He simply builds up a velocity so that when he hits the water, he's moving so fast that he simply runs across the top. You'll notice some of the bizarre means of transportation that we have to use in some of the sections of Mexico. But one of the amazing things about it is that in most areas this transportation has been provided in one form or another. Now, getting back to the control hunting, on this particular trip, rather than collecting animals primarily, we had been asked by a friend of mine in lower Mexico to come into his ranchero for the purpose of eliminating certain animals that were doing a considerable amount of damage. In this particular case, at this spot, we were trapping for the javelina, or peccary as he's sometimes called. The javelina is a relatively small member of the pig family, and as far as I know is the only native American wild pig. Now, this particular animal is equipped with a very large set of teeth and a very great willingness to defend himself. Now, like most wild animals, they are perfectly content to leave a human being alone, but if molested, the javelina is very quick to defend himself, and occasionally, if you wound a member of a pack, the other members will attack. Now, in the tropics, a hollow limb always offers the question of, rather than, is there an animal here, what animal is here? In general, there are very few hiding places in the tropics for most animals, and as a consequence, any dead tree will normally contain at least one living specimen of something or another. Of course, the interesting question is, will it be a fertilance, a monkey, an owl, or in this case, a kinkajou? A kinkajou is a tropical American member of the raccoon family, although he looks a lot more like a member of the monkey family. And in fact, In Spanish, he's called the monkey of the night, or mico de noche. By the way, he's one of the most savage little animals in the world, and although, again, he's perfectly content to leave a human being alone, and if properly raised from a tame baby, they do make a good pet. Nevertheless, he has very sharp teeth and a tremendous willingness to use these in defense. A tame one that I had in captivity at one time was tied up next to about 200 feet of garden hose, became entangled in it during the night, and during the night reduced it to a number of 6-inch pieces. He must have spent the greater part of the entire night simply chewing the hose up. Now, this fellow here is the giant tree weasel, or tyra. And although you're speaking of savage animals, the tyra, of course, ranks very high. Again, this is a type that can be made into a pet, although I must admit that they're rather unusual, and I've seen only about 2 that were really considered tame, and both of these were young. The weasels, of course, are among the most savage animals in the world for their size. Although this fellow here is a good climber, he does not have the prehensile tail, so that if you can lay hands upon him and get a hold of the tail, you can swing him out, and he is incapable of turning around and coming back up his own tail, as in the case of the kinkajou or most of the New World American monkeys. I mentioned in the past that a lot of people remark about our use of sacks to carry animals. But if you ever tried going through the jungle with a bunch of boxes in your pocket, you'd find how inconvenient it is, and just exactly how convenient a sack really is. Of course, sometimes it's quite a problem to get an animal into one. In this particular occasion, the little tyra there assumed that this was a means of escape by going into the hole, and he went in rather readily. Among the other things that we were attempting to reduce in this area were wildcats. They'd been doing a considerable amount of damage. Had killed a number of goats and were creating a pest of themselves. And on this particular occasion, we decided that this was a fairly small one, and we might be able to catch this specimen and bring him back alive. So rather than shooting him, we set up a tree there to see if we could catch him alive. Now, even though this was a small wildcat, I don't recommend this exercise for small children. At this point, he was trapped. He was out on a fairly large limb. There were some smaller limbs going out, but he didn't trust them to support his weight, or perhaps being a young one, he wasn't quite sure of his tree climbing ability. He wasn't sure at this point whether to run down the tree and into the man's face or farther along and attempt to take to one of the smaller limbs. Of course, again, once you can get hands on him, by the back of the neck in this case, it's fairly safe, and you can drop him out of the tree to someone waiting below. Now, returning to our noose trap considerably later, we found that a herd of javelinas had come along the game trail there. One had stepped into the noose, sprang the tree, which of course jumps immediately upright, tightens the noose around the foot. At this point, he had probably been fighting the noose for some few hours and was very tired. But don't assume from this that he was incapable of defending himself. These animals have extremely long teeth, and they are very quick to use them in defense. In a situation like this, the idea of controlling the animal with 2 ropes is rather obvious. If you put 1 rope on an animal, you can keep him from getting away, but nothing in the world can keep him away from you. So approaching from 2 sides, the idea is to get 2 ropes on him, and then by maintaining pressure on both the ropes, you can keep the animal in the middle and fairly well under control. Of course, sometimes when one of them slips, it becomes a little interesting. Now, we were hunting using, among other things, as weapons here, bows and arrows and .45 caliber submachine guns. At this point, the purpose of the submachine gun was as a safety weapon in the case of the return of the rest of the herd of javelinas. It is a common tactic among certain animals that run in packs, the elephant and the javelina in particular, to come to the defense of a trapped, a wounded, a sick, or a hurt member of the herd. It is not at all uncommon for a group of javelinas to be attracted by the cries of a trapped, a wounded, or a sick javelina and come to his assistance. And when they do so, they come with great swiftness and sometimes in great numbers. we were taking no chances at all. Of course, the use of a machine gun was a rather bizarre type of hunting, but we were interested in doing this primarily due to the fact that I had myself personally not used one since the Second World War, and I was interested in seeing if I could still use one at all and hit anything with it. Normally, a shotgun would be used for this purpose. Once you have rendered the javelina incapable of biting, his teeth, of course, are the important member of his weapons group there, and you have his mouth tied down. It's much easier to handle him, but sometimes the tying of the mouth is not the easiest part of it. The first time around here, the boy that put the string around the javelina's mouth had never handled one before, and he wasn't familiar with the system, and it slipped right off. So this time we inserted a stick behind the big teeth. You can get some idea of their size in this close-up picture here. By inserting a stick behind the teeth and bringing the string in behind this, the purpose of the stick, of course, is to keep the string from slipping off. Now, this is a method that can be used successfully on some animals and cannot be used successfully or otherwise on others. It depends a great deal upon the toughness of the animal's mouth. Now, if you attempted to tie up a cat in this manner, you probably would kill him. Most cats have a little difficulty with their breathing under restricted conditions, and you have to be very careful how you handle them. Also, they have a fairly tender mouth. The javelina, of course, has perfectly free breathing and a very tough mouth.
Well, that concludes the first part of this week's Authentic Adventure. But don't go away. We'll be back in just a moment with more thrills, more excitement on Wild Cargo, right after this brief message. Bart, if I recall correctly, you gave the impression at the start of the show that you were going to shoot javelina with a machine gun. So far, we've seen just trapping scenes. Do we get to that in the second part of the film?
Actually, Mel, I didn't mean to give the impression that we were going into Mexico for the purpose of slaughtering javelina. Our business in general is trapping or catching of animals, and upon occasion we do have to kill animals. I have been employed upon several occasions by governments and by private concerns, or in my own interest, in what we call control hunting, where we go into an area and we attempt to reduce or eliminate a certain type of animal that has made himself a pest in that region. That was not the case with the javelina, although I suppose that upon occasions and in certain areas the javelinas have become a pest. This was not true in the area we were hunting. Our purpose was to attempt to capture the javelinas and bring them back alive for resale. And in doing so, of course, we were hunting under conditions that were quite difficult. And in setting the snares and wandering through these regions and going back and checking them, it is quite common to encounter a group of javelinas at extremely close range, completely by surprise.
Well, that sets a pretty exciting preamble to the second part of the film. Let's watch it right now.
One of the big problems, of course, always in catching an animal is that of transporting him out. In this case, it was relatively simple, but sometimes it gets a little involved. Along the way here, Mel, we ran into a situation and were able to film what I consider one of the most fantastic examples of natural animal intelligence. Actually, instinct, I suppose, would be a better word to use in this case than intelligence. We encountered another baby bobcat in the act of doing combat with a harmless snake. Now, this bobcat, although he was practically an infant, demonstrated an intelligence, or rather an instinct, that was simply amazing. Approaching the snake, he used not his great speed, but rather his intelligence to attempt to mislead the snake into thinking that he, the bobcat, was not at all interested. Of course, at times he relied upon his speed, but in general he was putting on a tremendous job of acting here for the snake's benefit. Actually, of course, although this technique has been worked out in hundreds or perhaps thousands of generations of cats to befuddle the enemy into thinking that the cat is not interested, in this particular instance, the wonderful job of acting that he was doing was completely wasted due to the low intelligence of the snake. In other words, if this cat had been using this great acting technique on a more intelligent adversary, it might possibly have worked. But being so stupid, the snake was completely not misled, and the very good job of acting was completely wasted. You notice that last bit there, the cat rolled over on his back, closed his eyes, looked the other way, and while still on his back, reached over overhandedly and gave the snake a swat. Of course, at this point, actually, although the cat was the bigger of the two, the snake had somewhat of the advantage. Although the cat had the technique here, he was a little too young to have the weight behind him to lend any real power to his blows. At this point, of course, he is demonstrating a complete lack of interest there in an effort to fool the snake into thinking that he, the cat, is completely innocent. But in so doing, he got a little too close, so he momentarily withdrew to think the situation over. And upon returning to the scene of the combat, he decided that perhaps this acting routine wouldn't get it. So he's going to try to get down to business here. Now, you'll notice that all of a sudden his blows have acquired a little more authority here. He's moving faster and attempting to strike harder. But again, he's a little too young, and he hasn't learned to put his body weight behind the blows as yet. And, of course, he lacks the body weight really to place behind the blows. So although he's getting in his licks fairly well, he wasn't doing much damage. At this point, he decided perhaps a better tactic was that of speed. He'd dazzle the snake by his lightning-like movement. Another time out to sharpen the claws and think the situation over. And he comes back in for the fourth round. But sometimes, if you play with fire, you get burned. You'll notice he's being a little more wary now. Once burned, twice shy. About this point, the snake decided that this was enough of the foolishment, and so he withdrew. Of course, the cat couldn't follow, and although a fairly intelligent animal, he didn't realize that by jumping back over the log as he had been, he could have encountered the snake on the other side. Sitting up in a tree and waiting for the outcome was another adversary of the snake, however, that had a little more technique, and although he didn't have the body weight, he had the know-how and the talent to make up for lack of weight. Of course, as you know, the eagles and the hawks, in this particular case, this was a hawk, are among the greatest snake killers. They probably number about 20 or 30% of their entire diet in various types of snakes. So he made rather short work of a job that the cat had spent a considerable period of time attempting and had completely failed at. At this point, Mel, we had one of those accidents that do occur. In a matter of about 15 seconds, I was able to kill 3 of a group of javelina that ran in on us completely without warning. But one of my assistants had his leg badly mangled. And although the wound did heal up eventually, he had a fairly large chunk of meat bitten out of the back of his calf and it became badly infected. You Notice in this close-up the size of the teeth here. It'll give you some idea of the respect due this little animal.
Art, you never cease to amaze me. Well, that concludes the film portion of this week's show, but the show, of course, is far from over. Each week, Arthur brings live into the studio one of the many unusual animals that he's captured during his travels throughout the world. We'll meet our guest on Wild Cargo in just a moment.
Okay, fella, you can come out now. We're on the air. You say a thing.
I understand this is a tortoise. Well, actually, Mel, this isn't a common box tortoise. In fact, he's quite a rare animal. This is a specimen of the Peruvian giant red-footed tortoise, of a type that was discovered in Peru less than 2 years ago, and they are the fourth member of the group of giant land tortoises. Now, the biggest one of these that we have obtained so far was a little over 115 pounds, with a total shell length of 30 inches.
He's not a snapper, is he?
No, he's not a snapper, although even the tortoise sometimes will bite. They have in South America large numbers of a tortoise very closely related to this one, called the common red-footed tortoise, which is found throughout most of northern and western South America and certain sections of Central America. And typically, he's not much bigger than the average common box turtle or box tortoise that you have here in this country. Of course, with a shell length of 5 or 6 inches and a weight of less than a pound, up to as much as 3 or 4 pounds. Of course, in this country, we have one slightly larger type, which is called the Gopher Tortoise, or in Florida, they just refer to them simply as gophers. By the way, they're quite edible, and this animal, in fact, except for his value due to his rarity, would be quite a delectable centerpiece for the table.
Mm-hmm. Make enough soup, I think, to last family for a week. By the way, do they live as long as I've heard?
They do have a rather long lifespan, Mel, but certainly not into the hundreds of years, as certain people have implied.
Well, he sure is a fascinating guest, believe me. Tell us now, Art, about next week's story, will you?
Next week, Mel, we go back to Mexico. A lot of people recently have asked me about the job of producing these pictures and filming our activities on these trips, so we'll get a close-up look, among other things, at the actual operation of the filming that goes on one of our expeditions.
Well, that'll give you some idea of the excitement that's in store for us next week on Wild Cargo. Remember, these are not fictional episodes, but actual adventures filmed as they happened, where they happened, throughout the world. See you next week on Wild Cargo.